One thing you learned in the last episode of The Anti-Establishment Professor was that I was told when I was younger, growing up in the inner city of Chicago, that education would be the key to creating opportunity for my family. My mother dropped out of high school when she gave birth to me at 17. She believed that higher education was vitally important for my future, even though she couldn't pursue it. Little did she know, though, about the great issues that higher education was facing, even while she was still a young mother in 1985. Today, we're going to be talking about the funding of higher education and why it has declined over the years, and specifically how the Higher Education Act and President Lyndon Johnson's vision of it as the great equalizer in the American economy has never truly worked to create the very opportunities it said it would. So why did higher ed funding decline? Before we can answer that question, we kind of have to look at the history of government funding for higher ed. So I want to kind of take us through some of the key points in time when the government was funding higher ed specifically for certain reasons or in terms of trying to create growth within education for our country. So throughout history, the relationship between the federal government and higher education has changed. And along with it has been a change in the priorities and regulations in which federal funds are provided to higher education. The first point that I want to look at is the Morrill Act of 1862. So this basically helped grow the evolving network of state universities by granting public lands to every state for the endowment and maintenance of at least one college. And I know there's also the whole mess of stolen lands taken from indigenous populations, but that's something that we're going to get to, hopefully, in future episodes. The second Morrill Act included additional grants to certain fields of studies as well. Another expansion in federal programs was during the Great Depression. So in 1937, federal aid to students reached its peak when 139,000 students, or about 11% of all students, received an average of $12 per month for undergraduates and $20 per month for graduate students as part of the National Youth Administration's Work-Study Program. Federal support for higher education expanded greatly during World War II, increasing to over $300 million in 1944. The late 1950s saw the creation of the first generally available student loan program through the passage of the National Defense Education Act in 1958. So obviously a lot of these funds were going towards the war effort. The next major milestone in federal support for higher education was the passage of the Higher Education Act of 1965. And it's this very act that I think had the most far-reaching impact in terms of relevance to what we are still seeing and impacted by today. Title V of this legislation created the student grant and loan programs that still provide the foundations of financial aid support for students at the beginning of the 21st century. Provision of this support was based on the financial need of the students and their families. The aid, both grants and loans, was targeted at the nation's neediest students. In addition to the broad-based student aid programs, the Higher Education Act also provided direct funding for college libraries, historically black colleges and universities, and a number of smaller specialized programs. The Higher Education Act has as one of its goals the equalization of educational opportunity for all students in the United States. President Lyndon Johnson explained that the goal for the act was to seek to remedy the appalling frequency with which students back then were presented in terms of having to be forced to forego the opportunity of post-secondary education because of the inability to meet the cost. They couldn't pay for it, they couldn't afford it. The provision of aid under Title V of the Act has been made almost exclusively based on the financial need of the student and his or her family. In the early years, the emphasis was on meeting the college access needs of poor students through the use of grants. When first fully funded in fiscal year 1975, Pell Grants, the foundation grant programs within this, provided more than 80% of the cost of attendance. This included tuition, room and board, books, and other expenses at a typical public four-year institution. Loans were available for students who basically wanted to attend a more expensive institution. So where did things go wrong? One thing to note is that over the next 25 years, the Pell Grant program did not keep pace with the rise in college costs. By fiscal year 2000, the maximum Pell Grant provided only 40% of the cost of attendance at a public four-year college. While total Pell Grant spending had grown 691% over the preceding 25 years, federal loan volume had increased 2,000% over the same period, thus shifting the foundation of the Title V programs from getting grants, which you don't have to pay back, to loans. Johnson's vision of the Higher Education Act as a great equalizer in the American economy is at risk, and I personally think it has been since its very inception. The reality is that the divide between the haves and have-nots in higher education is almost as great today as it was in the mid-1960s. In the past decade alone, the percentage of students from families at the highest income levels who received a bachelor's degree has grown to 82%. Meanwhile, for those at the bottom, it has fallen to just 8%. This isn't just in higher education either. If we look at public, elementary, and high schools, the impact is still great. The original legislation Johnson believed would not work without further reforms. At the time that Congress passed this education legislation, it was approved to basically slate in other domestic programs to expand opportunities for the working and the middle class, such as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, the War on Poverty, rent subsidies for low-income housing, Medicare, and Medicaid. They were also pushing for food stamps in the Model Cities program and the Urban Mass Transportation Act. During the late 1960s and 1970s, according to Elizabeth Casico and Sarah Reber in their chapter in The Legacies of the War on Poverty, federal spending through Title I diminished the difference between poorer and wealthier districts. The legislation also provided the federal government with leverage so it could ensure the desegregation of Southern schools. And if we look at what a lot of these people in Congress and legislators and things like that back then were fighting over, kind of is very evident in terms of why this was such a big issue. So while the basic vision behind the ESEA was very sound, the policy also introduced new and very large problems. For one, the legislation did not provide for adequate oversight of how the money was used, and the guidelines governing how funds would be allocated and applied were poorly crafted. So in coming decades, many school administrators would end up using the money for purposes other than what they were intended. Basically, a practice that continues to this day in some districts. Basically, money that was supposed to be used for new programs helping poor children was then instead taken for something else, like to cover funding gaps in budgets. Then the Vietnam War hit, and once again, there was this push and pull between funding military spending or focusing on those at great risk within our own communities. Conservative policymakers during the Reagan era prompted further policy shifts, pushing priorities away from what they criticized as reckless welfare spending. More importantly, however, the conservative backlash against the Great Society, which was the idea that basically emanated from this, and it started as early as the 1966 midterm election, basically undercut the liberals' effort to pass the rest of Johnson's agenda, including greater funding for anti-poverty initiatives and robust urban redevelopment programs, and it resulted in budgetary cuts to existing domestic programs like those outlined in the Economic Opportunity Act. According to Johnson, inferior schooling was only one challenge facing children living in poor communities, and educational enhancements couldn't have the intended impact unless other barriers were lifted. Classroom improvement was contingent on improvements to housing and other aspects of community life, something that we still see as an issue affecting many today, and very much the agenda that the progressives have been fighting for. You know, all that socialism people are afraid of. Ronnie Reagan thinks we're snowflakes too. Did you know that? So there was also this shift in 1967 as Ronald Reagan rose in political power in California, which I believe had farther reaching effects than anyone could even imagine back then. So in 1967, California's higher educational system was like the envy of the world. It was the epitome of what higher ed would be. It was also where campus protests of the 60s were dominating, where the progressive youth and people of color and many others were demanding change in terms of race, equality, and pushing for intellectual curiosity. Reagan went on a platform of cutting taxes and reducing state spending, and he basically told universities that there were some intellectual luxuries that they would have to do without. He stated at a press conference on February 28th in 1967 that the taxpayers should not be in the business of subsidizing intellectual curiosity. And of course, it's an issue to fund intellectual curiosity when it's challenging the status quo and the conservative mindset. He pushed for colleges to focus on workforce entry skills. This is something that I'm continuing to hear even today in 2020, the whole argument that people shouldn't be getting those sissy liberal arts degrees and should be getting into the trades. And not that this is a bad thing, but I don't think it's the answer to our higher ed problem here in the States. This is in opposition also to the idea that college is meant to be a place of intellectual development and that focuses on long-term ideals about what kinds of skills are actually useful to the world in the long run. Personally, I think that while workforce-related skills are helpful, this focus is also very, very good at creating corporate robots who don't question authority or management or the government for that matter. And it also creates this false dichotomy that colleges have to be a job creation tool rather than a place where you can learn to question what you're told, learn to form solid thoughts and opinions, and also develop abilities that might end up benefiting you in the long run rather than having immediate payoff. Yet, even when we see these trade schools in action, they don't always pay off, and often the cost-benefit equation is greatly overestimated. And then to add more salt to the wound, those coming from poorer communities still end up on the shorter end of the stick because there's still other economic disadvantages that they're up against, like the wage gap and wealth inequality and racial discrimination. A lot of Reagan's growth was due to his ability to actually place higher education as the enemy in response to the growing political turmoil of college campuses. He even went as far as calling protesters filthy speech advocates. I think we can draw a lot of parallels to what we're even seeing today between conservatives and progressives and protesters from organizations like Black Lives Matter and even those calling for college for all. He'd probably call us snowflakes too. Since that moment in time, the rhetoric around higher education funding has greatly influenced federal and state policy. That pivotal moment was crucial in the sharp increase in higher education costs. Reagan's rhetoric definitely previewed many of the future changes we would see, specifically the idea that education is seen as a privilege and not a right, which has continued to further negatively impact those from impoverished communities, specifically BIPOC people. There's an article that I found while researching this episode from the New York Times that outlines a tremendous amount of proposed changes in 1981 that ended up coming to fruition due to Reagan's cuts. It's linked below, but the gist of the story is that cuts were focused on education of the poor and handicapped, consolidation of grants, 20% cut in federal aid for things like bilingual education and aid to school libraries, and reduction in federal matching grants to states. And the impact ended up being all the greater because many states ended up reducing state financing for schools. And the ones hurt primarily were those from poorer communities who needed help the most. So we can see where their allegiances lied. We can see what their priorities were, and it wasn't to lift people up. Trying to make things better only ended up making things worse. So George W. Bush teamed up with the Massachusetts Democratic Senator Ted Kennedy to try and fix federal education policy in 2001. And unfortunately, they didn't end up making things better for students themselves, and in my very humble educator's opinion, they ended up making things harder for those in the poorer communities who are already having difficulties. The policymakers who helped craft that legislation didn't give much attention to Johnson's original vision, that education reform would only work if the government dealt with the entire host of problems confronting the poor: wages, equality, race issues, and environment. And by environment, I mean infrastructure and the communities that they live in. But I also do think if we're looking at it from today's perspective, the environmental impact is also important because many of these communities face things like industrial pollution. The realization that education reform could only work packaged within a set of policies to also combat economic inequality absolutely disappeared. The product of that whole bipartisan compromise was the No Child Left Behind Act, the present-day iteration of the ESEA, and it sought to impose standards rather than provide resources and solutions. Tests and, Standardized tests could be like a whole episode, but let's just say you can't stick a square peg in a round hole. The new testing measures that were implemented to measure whether teachers and administrators were meeting those standards have done very little to help children within the classroom. How can things be standardized when there are such enormous disparities in programs offered by wealthier and poorer schools? It doesn't make sense to me either, I know. Things like the after-school programs or extracurricular activities are vastly different in places like inner city Chicago versus like the wealthier area of Chicago and River North. It's also important to note that lower income children often come from communities where there's less social awareness and support from family and peer groups who are actually moving through the educational institutions successfully. Harvard scholar Robert Putnam explains that the education gap is created more by what happens to kids before they get to school, by things that happen outside of school, and by what kids bring or they don't bring with them to school, some bringing resources and others bringing challengers, than by what the schools actually do to them. So now that we've talked a bit about this whole change and what was going on, and not just, higher ed, but also in elementary and public schools in general, I want to talk about college funding today. When the baby boomers went to college in the 1960s and 1970s, many of them paid little in tuition at nearly free public institutions or received generous federal and state grants that they didn't have to pay back that paid for most of their bachelor's degrees. Also keep in mind that the majority of the people attending were white, middle, and upper class Americans. Also, during the past 2 decades, as members of that very same generation came to power in Washington and state legislatures, or as college presidents and trustees, they continued to preside over the decay of the basic building blocks of the Higher Education Act as they drastically increased tuition and pulled back on financial aid. More than a decade since the Great Recession hit, state spending on public colleges and universities remains well below historic levels, despite recent increases. So overall, state funding for public 2- and 4-year colleges in 2017 was nearly $9 billion below its 2008 level after adjusting for inflation. The funding decline has contributed to higher tuition and reduced quality on campus, as colleges have had to balance budgets by basically reducing faculty, limiting course offerings, and in some cases closing campuses. At a time when the benefit of a college education has never been greater, state policymakers have made going to college less affordable and less accessible to the students most in need. As states have slashed higher education funding, the price of attending public colleges has risen significantly faster than what families can even afford. For the average student, increases in federal student aid and the availability of tax credits have not kept up, jeopardizing the ability of many people to afford the college education that is key to their long-term financial success. Deep state funding cuts have had major consequences for public colleges and universities. States, and to a lesser extent, localities, provide roughly 53% of the costs of teaching and instruction at these schools. Schools have made up the difference with tuition increases, cuts to educational services and other services, or both. Since the recession took hold, higher education institutions have raised tuition and reduced the academic opportunities and student services. Published tuition is up more than 60%. So these sharp tuition increases have accelerated longer-term trends of college becoming less affordable and costs shifting from states to students. Over the last 20 years, the price of attending a 4-year public college or university has grown significantly faster than the median income. Although federal student aid has risen, on average, it falls short of covering the increases in tuition and other college expenses. Let's also keep in mind that the cost of aid is tremendous, causing students to graduate with burdensome student loan payments that they're often not able to pay. We also mentioned reduced academic opportunities and student services. So the tuition increases have compensated for only part of the revenue loss resulting from state funding cuts. Over the past several years, public colleges and universities have cut faculty positions, eliminated course offerings, closed campuses, and reduced student services, among other cuts. I'm personally a direct reflection of that very issue. As an adjunct professor, we're often contract workers with no benefits and most often the lowest paid with no opportunity for tenure. They hire us because it's less risky and cheaper for the schools. I personally think that they should probably pay their presidents less and invest in hiring adjuncts full time so they can offer students a stronger educational program, but who am I to talk? Now, new threats to education have reared their ugly heads as conservatives in Congress push for cuts to the federal budget, including steep reductions in Pell Grant funding that would further reduce the resources available to poor Americans seeking a higher education. So what is the government to do? So what are we to do? Many argue, and I argue, that it will be important to return to the more holistic approach that Johnson and the liberals of that era, or what I consider much more like progressives of our era, envisioned in terms of this as a social policy. Education was always part of a bigger plan, a bigger package that they were fighting for. Education was part of the Great Society where other programs dealt with issues like health care, the reinvigoration of cities, and without a living wage or better public housing and stronger civic institutions, all the education policies in the world will only have a limited effect on poor communities. Ever since Congress passed that historic legislation in 1965, partisan wrangles and arguments and disputes over spending priorities have pushed the government off course. We need to do more, and we need to look at this as an opportunity to benefit our country as a whole. We need to stop being so quick to label these ideas as scary, evil, commie socialism garbage, because they're not. When we look at countries like Sweden and Denmark and much of the whole European nations, they work. Most importantly, they work for the people, and not just for the 1%. So while I will continue fighting for college for all for my kids, I also know it has to be part of a holistic approach that includes working through issues like healthcare, racial equality, wage equality, and stronger civic institutions that fight for the well-being of all and not just the wealthy. Thanks for watching this latest episode of The Anti-Establishment Professor. If you like videos like these, let me know and feel free to give this video a thumbs up. As an educator in the arts and creative fields, things like this are a vital part of my journeys. So I decided to create this series on this channel that I often dedicate to creative tutorials and documenting my freelance art career journey through art vlogs. Because I think it's something that's important and relevant to what I do and to the things that I hold true and that I believe to my core. So make sure you check out my last video all about student debt. I'll include it in a link above, and stay tuned for the next video all about how Sallie Mae got so evil. And it talks more about the student loan system, and we're going to explore some of the issues and the ideas behind it. Please consider subscribing to my channel as well so that you can get notified when I post. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.